Hi, this is Dean Miller back with another video of the significance of the life of Jesus. This is in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13 in the NLT Bible. This is Jesus' transfiguration up on the mountain. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became as white as light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly beloved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." The disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Then his disciples asked him, "Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes?" Jesus replied, "Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready, but I tell you, Elijah has already come, but he wasn't recognized, and they chose to abuse him. In the same way, they will also make the Son of Man suffer." The disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. So the Transfiguration is a vision, and it's a brief glimpse of the true glory of the King, and a brief glimpse of into heaven, of what our future is going to be when we trust in Jesus. This special revelation was a divine affirmation to these 3 disciples of everything Jesus did and what he's about to do. Here we see the answer to the last verse in chapter 16. And I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So he takes these 3 to the top of this mountain to show them what's going to be coming in his kingdom. So verse 1 says, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and 2 brothers, James and John, who were the sons of thunder, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. So 6 days after Jesus made the statement in chapter 16, this links to the events in chapter 16 here with the Transfiguration with Jesus. Peter, James, and John were in the inner circle among the 12. These are the 3 that witnessed Jesus' rising the dead girl in Matthew 9:25. And here they witnessed the Transfiguration, and they accompanied Jesus to Gethsemane in Matthew 26:37. Peter and John play a main role in the building of the church, and James had a similar role, but he was one of the earliest disciples to be martyred in church history. He was killed by Herod. So Jesus and God used high mountains as retreats, or locations often used to talk or show his glory, like he did when he talked to Moses for the 10 Commandments, and often Jesus went to the top of the mountains to talk to people too, to be alone. So Matthew says they're alone, and Jesus entrusts his 3 closest friends, who would be the key to church leaders, to pass on the vision to the rest of the believers after the resurrection. This experience would be a source of encouragement to the church through difficult times. So verse 2, it says, as the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, so that his face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as light. So Jesus was transfigured right in front of these disciples. He was transformed. Like Moses faced Jesus, shining light shone and reflected a transcendent glory. So like with the burning bush and all that, God's going to reflect his glory when he's talking to someone. Jesus' clothes became white as light. This was not simply white, but with such brilliance that it partook of the very nature of light itself. So transfigured is transformed. It's kind of like a caterpillar or a butterfly. Transfigured is an outward change that comes from within. So Jesus is showing you what his inner spirit's going to do when we die. It's going to transform, and we're going to get our new body. So this reveals to the disciples that there's a secure place for us with Jesus in the future. Verse 3 says, Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. So here you see the appearance of two additional figures, Moses and Elijah, who may represent the two most prominent of the prophets from the Old Testament. Moses was the prophet of the law, and Elijah was the prophet of the prophecies. So he was kind of like over all the prophets. He was considered like one of the better prophets. So the presence of Moses and Elijah with Jesus indicates their complete unity with him. Elijah never did die. He was one of the two that didn't die. He was taken directly into heaven by a fiery tornado, and Moses died and he was buried by God. Both men had prophetic roles beyond their lifetimes. Moses was a model future prophet, and Elijah was Jesus' forerunner. In Luke 9:31 it says that they were glorious to see, and they were speaking about his exodus from this world, which was about to be filled in Jerusalem. So they were talking about Jesus' resurrection. That's what it says in Luke. The disciples probably thought these two loomed over Jesus in their minds. They probably thought that Elijah and Moses was above Jesus, but they found out that Jesus was the one who loomed over them. He was their creator and the mighty God who gave Moses and Elijah the prophetic words that they spoke and wrote. One purpose of this transfiguration was to rearrange the order of priority that Jesus and the human prophets had in the disciples' minds. So this would make up their mind of who actually was over who. Jesus was God, and he was over Elijah and Moses. So the fact that Jesus was talking with Moses and Elijah indicates a foretaste of heaven. This binds the importance of Jesus as being up there above, which is considered the greatest two prophets. In verse 4, Peter exclaimed, "Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." As you see, Peter, who's always got to do something, makes a statement, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. So this is considered with his character when he don't know what to do, just like we do a lot of times. We don't know what to do in these situations. But he wanted to do something, and he said, "It is good for us to be here," is an expression of amazement and joy. He recognized the privilege of being in the presence of the glorious Messiah as well as Moses and Elijah. Peter says, "As if you wish," shows his reverence to Jesus and the great prophets by building 3 shelters or memorials. Peter wanted to build sacred shrines, but this was a time for worship and adoration. He wanted to memorialize the moment, but he was supposed to learn from this moment and move on. So then verse 5 says, "But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my dearly beloved, loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him.'" So this was kind of like a correcting Peter, be quiet, listen. So Peter was interrupted by the Father himself. A cloud overshadowed them, and a voice rang out. God recognized Peter's good intentions in wanting to honor the 3, but he corrected Peter's misconception by elevating his son above others. God told him, "This is my dearly beloved Son who brings me great joy. Listen to him." If Jesus brings God great joy, what do you think he needs to bring us in our lives? We need to keep listening. We need to always listen to Jesus because he is the truth. When the Father affirmed Jesus as his Son, the disciples gained a better idea of Jesus' true identity, the glorious and suffering Messiah. And one thing, too, is it's kind of amazing how they recognize who Moses and Elijah is, which gives us hope that when we die and go to heaven, that we'll know some of our loved ones also. So God expressed his love for his Son, and the disciples had a better understanding why Jesus was pleasing to the Father. He had been and would be obedient to the Father even to his death. God said, "Listen to him," saying that the words of Jesus were above the words of Moses and Elijah. Jesus was the talking gospel. Jesus was the truth. His words are the truest words that could ever be spoken. Just like we are, the ears of the disciples had to hear all of Jesus' teachings, but the ears of their hearts were not fully open yet to the meaning of what he was going to reveal to them. Just like we are. When we have our eyes, we listen, and we see what happens. But when we open up our hearts and actually truly believe and understand, that's when things will start getting better and we'll start understanding things better. So verses 6 through 8, it says, the disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. The Father's proclamation was so frightening that these three disciples were unable to look him in the face, and they fell face down on the ground. So they did what all people do in the presence of God when, throughout the Bible, they fall flat on their faces with fear. They're fearful because they're not worthy to be with God. This is the true element of worship, even though it was motivated by fear. Jesus ministered to these disciples through the ministry of touch. Jesus calmed all fears of these disciples after they had witnessed his glorious and awesome power. The touch of Jesus will heal all things. So you see Jesus go to them, and he touches them and told them to get up. They raised their faces from the ground and looked around, and everything was back to normal. The brilliant light of his face and his clothes faded, but the memory was theirs forever. This etched a pattern in Paul and all their lives, because Paul writes about it several times in his Gospels about this happening here. So verse 9 says, as they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So Jesus knew this revelation would be misused and misunderstood by others, even among the 12. In the wrong hands, this testimony could turn into a show, distracting from Jesus' purpose while the cross still loomed in the future. Jesus warned them not to say anything until after his death and he was raised from the dead, because then they would truly understand what he was talking about. They knew he was the Messiah, but they had much more to learn about the significance of his death and his resurrection. Verses 10 through 13 says, then his disciples asked him, why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes? Jesus replied, Elijah is indeed coming, first to get everything ready, but I tell you, Elijah has already come, but he wasn't recognized. They chose to abuse him, and in the same way will also make the Son of Man suffer. Jesus' command for silence grew out of his realization that the multitudes of Israel had the wrong concept of the Messiah. They thought he'd come to be the conquering king that they longed for, but they didn't anticipate for him to be the suffering Messiah. He had to go to Jerusalem. He had no choice. He must die, and he must hang on that cross, and he didn't want to encourage anyone to follow him for the wrong reasons. He had to do this. It was God's will. This was God's plan for Jesus. These disciples seen Elijah on the mountain. They knew the scribes anticipated Elijah's presence and the association with the Messiah. They didn't understand why and when Elijah was going to come. They couldn't tell anyone about it. Jesus told them that they understood the Old Testament correctly, and Jesus' promise that Elijah would restore things with his paraphrase of Malachi 4:6. Then Jesus said, I tell you, the prophecy of Elijah has been fulfilled by John the Baptizer. Israel was represented by these hypocritical leaders who didn't recognize John as God's coming Elijah because of their stubbornness, their blindness, and their hardened hearts. They chose to abuse him, John the Baptist, the same way they're going to abuse Jesus. They would have him killed like Herod killed John, in their hatred and their ignorance. They didn't respond the way that God would have wanted them to, so they mistreated the forerunner and the Messiah. These groups rejected both John and Jesus. And then verse 13 says, then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. And you see that the understanding was complete. The prophecy of Elijah was filled by John the Baptist. So what we can take away from this is we have a bright future ahead of us. Jesus is our future. He died on that cross for us to be saved, to go to heaven with him. And we need to not show ignorance like these Pharisees did and these people and reject him. You know, we need to trust his words, we need to obey his words, and we need to follow Jesus, because that's the only way we're going to get to heaven. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one can make it to the Father except through him. That's the only way we're going to heaven is through Jesus. So don't have hardened hearts. This passage here is inspiration to the disciples to show them who Jesus' true glory really was, and that there is an afterlife. There is a kingdom of heaven. And one day we'll be in that heaven if we believe. So thank you for listening to my videos. I hope you have a better understanding. Please like my video and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. Leave a comment in the comment section. And I hope everyone has a Merry Christmas. Thank you. Amen.